Welcome back to the show, everybody. It's your host, John Scardina. I am so excited to have Rachel on the show. She's going to be talking to me about organizational style emergency management. We've been on this kick for a while now to look at the different aspects of emergency management, not just public safety, while that's incredibly important, but looking at the campuses, looking at hospitals, looking at universities, looking at all these different aspects of emergency management, especially working in corporations is totally different. You have different lines of authority and needs and continuity of operations and all this stuff that's really important. Rachel comes from us from L3 Harris. Now, I just got to give a big shout out real fast. L3 Harris is one of our major sponsors. They've been supporting us for a really long time. This is not going to be an ad for L3 Harris, although the ad for L3 Harris will play later, and they are very cool. Make sure you check out their radios. But we actually are going to talk to the emergency manager who's going to be working in or who works in L3 Harris as their emergency manager for the actual staff. Really cool stuff. Rachel, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, John. I'm really excited to talk about emergency and crisis management.
Perfect. So let's actually dive into just those terminologies here real fast, because when I say emergency management in the U.S., my counterparts in Europe typically call it crisis management. And we've talked about that a little bit. But in terms of a U.S. perspective, why the different terms? Why the need to differentiate that?
It's actually a really great question. And I feel like we're working on standardizing that a lot more. I know, the ISO is coming up with a standard for crisis management here soon to tie into the security and resiliency portions of the ISO, which I'm really excited about, because I feel like as emergency management is growing as a field, so is crisis management. So the differentiation, in my opinion, because there isn't really the standard published yet, is that emergency management deals more with the community, whereas crisis management deals more with the business. So in emergency management, we're looking at kind of similar objectives, but we're looking at focusing on the whole community, protecting the whole community. There's a lot more involved with, the community lifelines, things of that nature. Whereas when you're working in crisis management, the parts of like mitigation and recovery are very different because they're business oriented. While we still have the same objectives of life safety and protecting the environment and structures, it's just a little different focus.
That's so funny. That's actually a really good explanation of how they're slightly different. I've talked to the head of security. I've talked to crisis managers. I've talked to the emergency management director. I've talked to people with emergency management and crisis management, and all those positions that I've talked to on this show, they all call themselves, different titles, but they all explain coordination and stakeholder involvement. And it's really funny. One guy was telling me how, he's like, hey, I'm the head of security, but I actually don't do anything with the physical security staff. I have somebody who's in charge of physical security, and I'm actually doing all the coordination. So when you talk about a lack of standardization, you're like 100% right. I mean, and it's hard to figure out where those lines are. I like the fact that when there's no standardization, you can go in there and say, okay, if there's no standardization, I'm going to create one for my specific jobs and, my perspective. And so you're able to kind of parcel where you need to spend your time. Essentially, that's kind of what you're getting at, right?
That's exactly what I do for a living and I feel like that's the best way to do it. A lot of times if you come in with the mentality of this is the way it's supposed to be, this is the framework, this is what, all of the recommended resources say that I do, you're going to fail because you're not putting in the unique flavor of where you're working. You're not looking at your community. You're not looking at what's already established. And so when you come in with just the baseline framework understanding of what our responsibilities are, and that's communication, collaboration, coordination, then you're able to look at what really needs to be done and actually build a program that's successful.
Real quick, we're going to pause for this week's Disaster Tough endorsements. How do you spell Doberman Emergency Management? EOP, OEP, HVA, HMP, Thyra, TTX, Drone, PDA. Whenever you need an expert, Doberman Emergency Management field experts are there for support. Contact an expert at DobermanEMG.com today. The L3 Harris Extreme 400P radio solves problems and is specifically designed for emergency services. How do we know? We field tested it with medical, urban search and rescue, and collapse and confined structures. This radio is amazingly tough. Check out the L3 Harris Extreme 400p radio at l3harris.com right now.
Okay, let's jump back in.
Yeah, it's that's a really good call out again. You're talking about the different flavors. In my mind, I was like, okay, what's the cayenne pepper of emergency management? What's the salt and pepper? You're gonna have your basics, and then maybe some thyme in there, which we never have any of.
Never. There's never time.
I need to have a chef on the show. Maybe we can go through the different flavors of. There's Flavor Flav. I don't know.
We could make recipes. I love
Oh my
this.
gosh,
They could make an EOCs.
Do you like cooking?
I do.
I like smoking meat on like a barbecue.
Okay. To be fair, I prefer baking, which isn't really cooking. It's more of a science than an art.
Okay.
But
can we just no? That's like saying emergency management and crisis management, cooking versus baking.
I know. Sorry.
The difference is okay. So my wife, I will make my wife brownies from scratch.
That's impressive.
I will take the box and I'll pour it in there, put the eggs, and I'll mix, and I'll add in the oil, and I'll grease the pan, and I'll throw it in there, and I'll bake it. And I'll say, Erin, my wife's name is Erin, I just made you brownies from scratch. And she goes, John, this is not brownies from scratch. And she pulls out the flour and everything. I think that's messed up. I think if you have to mix things together, it's a whole other side conversation. But
I think from box is scratch. My son makes the most amazing pumpkin bread from Trader Joe's. Like,
really?
We're obsessed with it. Yes.
Okay. First of all, Trader Joe's, if you're listening to this, sponsor our podcast. But okay.
And send us more pumpkin bread, please.
What a funny tangent that is. Okay, so if you're into baking and I'm into grilling, and I add different flavors on top of my meat, like I try to do 2 or 3 different flavors, just as a fun random exercise that we did not plan at all. This might go terribly. What are the basic flavors of emergency management, and how do you enhance the flavors of emergency management? This is going to be so weird.
So what's the salt and pepper?
Describe this whole thing.
Yeah. I love it. So salt and pepper, I believe, is communication, coordination, and collaboration every time. Those are, I'm going to get those tattooed on my forehead. It is so important. If we can't talk to one another, if we can't work together, and we can't make sure that what we're doing lines up with one another, if that makes sense, then what are we doing? That's the basics of any emergency management. I'm going to make t-shirts because I say these things so many times that there need to be t-shirts. Emergency management and crisis management is relationship management. It is our job to make sure that everyone is working together towards the same goal. So that is the salt and pepper of emergency management.
Yeah, I like that. I mentioned cayenne pepper earlier.
What's the spice of life in emergency management?
The spice of life? Yeah, it's probably my go-to spice. It's not even like, it just adds a little bit, adds a little bit of color, adds a little bit of flavor, so not too much. So if you're going to slightly enhance something in emergency management with the cayenne pepper of emergency management, we're going to scrap this entire episode. I would say, you know what? This is going to be kind of random, but I think it's after actions, because after actions, they could really enhance. They really could. I mean, if people did them right, but most of the time it's like, we'll do an after action. They'll name all these solutions and maybe implement one if you're lucky.
So I was actually going to say a good exercise program, which includes after actions. So I agree and add a well-planned, well-executed exercise program.
I would say that is the, oh my gosh, I'm trying to think of the curry.
The oregano?
No, not the oregano. It's mutton curry. Is that the one that's really? There's
no idea.
I love curry. In fact, there's a famous story where we went out to Hurricane Matthew, and the incident started to die down a little bit. Basically the storm essentially missed most of Florida. It was supposed to hit, then it missed, And so we had a little extra time, and I went to an Indian restaurant. This is so embarrassing. I went to an Indian restaurant and ate my fill. I love Indian food. It's like some of my favorite food. I went out to an Indian restaurant. It was an all you can eat. I ate way too much. I went back to the JFO, the Joint Field Office, there in Tallahassee, and I came up to the planning section chief, and I was like, "I'm sorry, I need to go pass out." And he's like, "What?" I'm like, "I can't do my job right now. I need to go to sleep." And he's like, "You're kidding, right?" It's like, "No." And I went back to my hotel and I slept for like 4 hours, just right in the middle of the afternoon, during the middle of a response. Most
Awesome.
unprofessional moment of my life. But I was so full.
So I think this is a really good point that food and responding to emergencies are, intrinsically entwined. So I think making an emergency management cookbook is the next step.
You know what? That would be probably a pretty fun exercise, but it would also be terrible for like any type 1, because it'd be like your 2 recipes would be like Subway sandwiches and like late night Little Caesars pizza. Like that.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
That's your cookbook. But
Donuts left over from the first shift.
oh my gosh. Oh yes, they're only slightly stale. Yeah. Dip them in milk. Okay, let's get back on track here a
Yeah.
little bit.
Okay.
With that random digression. My producer is going to be like, "What are we going to be doing with that first 10 minutes?" Okay, so organizational style emergency management. We've been on this kick where we've been addressing, again, going back to terms, organizational, enterprise. Some people call it enterprise emergency management.
Yeah.
When I think about the people, I call it dynamic populations, which has been big asterisk, big kick for us lately, talking about how your population constantly changes, daytime versus nighttime, all those things. And so, for an overview perspective, or those emergency managers who only have worked in public safety or in a college program, we have a lot of college students right now. Can you kind of walk through some of the different nuances of your job?
I think the nuances are the team, so the people I work with. There's a lot more involvement with the business continuity and risk management aspect than you would probably have. And again, because business continuity is kind of that mitigation and recovery aspect of emergency management. So we're all a part of that cycle, which leads me to focus more on the preparedness and the response portion of it. So, and then looking at insurance risk versus, a threat and hazard assessment, it's difficult when you come from the world of public safety and emergency management to explain to people all the bad things that could happen, because a lot of times businesses are just looking at insurance risk. So being able to take that framework and that mindset and interpret it in a way that they understand. I think the interpretation was probably the hardest part in switching over, is being able to interpret what public safety emergency management is into a corporate context, using the right jargon, the right terms. That one took me a while. I'm still learning. That's a whole new book of words.
Basically, my thing is your stakeholders, right?
Mm-hmm.
You are representing an organizational footprint, right? Like the actual campus. First responders show up for an active shooter, for an evacuation, for a fire, what name you.
Yeah.
They are in control because they have the legal authorities to act. However,
Yeah.
you have all the responsibility from the organizational standpoint to make sure that process runs smoothly. What do you do in the preparation phase to make sure that response does go smoothly? What are your actual job functions?
Yeah, we include them. So I think that's, again, that relationship management. So a lot of what I've been focusing on is building relationships, and our security organization had started this before I started. So I've only been with L3Harris for about 15 months now. So it's really in the early stages of me putting my spin on what crisis management is at L3Harris. So our security organization has worked really closely with the local PD. I included relationships with our local emergency managers. I also reached out to the state of Florida, our CISA contacts, and then I also reach out to organizations throughout the country and actually across the globe, because we're in 29 different countries. So making sure that, it's super cool, making sure we're making those contacts and just building those relationships so that when I call and I say I'm from L3Harris, people know what that means. And we're really fortunate, and especially working with CISA, they're so amazing. So we're part of the national critical infrastructure, as most of the defense industrial bases. We also fall under communications as well. And it really helps that when I have a conversation with those first responders and in the preparation phase, again, shake hands before so you're not pointing fingers after, that I can speak the same language as them. So
Yes.
having that shorthand and being able to have that really easy communication just makes it that much easier. So I feel that people who come from business continuity or the risk legal side of it have their own jargon and don't quite speak first responder. So I really believe having that ability to speak that same language is what makes us more successful.
Primary example of different jargon, mitigation. When I talk about mitigation to law enforcement, we've been helping out on, unfortunately, because of real world active shooter stuff lately. And when we say mitigation, they are thinking mitigating the immediate threat, i.e., the individual is already on site. Now it's time to mitigate and to react. Essentially, mitigate equals react. When we say mitigate, or when I typically use mitigate, I'm talking about you're on step one of a long road here. Let's prevent the shooter from showing up, or and so just understanding that language, that jargon, and how it's different, and the same words mean totally different things is huge. I've definitely oh my gosh, so I almost pigeonholed my career. Luckily, I was able to navigate it out, but when I joined the National Strike Team, they brought me on because I had an operations background, but they had me lead GIS. And essentially, the planning section chief said, GISers can't talk to people in operations, and you need to bridge that gap. And I would be standing there, and GISers would be blue in the face, and people in the operations section would be blue in the face and be yelling at each other, be saying the exact same thing. And I'm like, you mean totally different things. You're not even. So, I mean, that's a great call out. I mean, great idea. And I think it's applicable for anybody in any field, or any aspect of our field. Hey, are you sure that the words that you're saying, what's that phrase from Rush Hour? You understand the words that are coming out of my mouth?
Yes.
One of my favorite lines.
Yeah.
Can you repeat back to me what I just said and what you think it means? So important.
Yeah. I actually, this was a lesson I learned ridiculously early in my career. So I didn't figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up until I was much older. And then it became very clear that this is the path I was meant to be on. Awesome. And so after I got my degree, I interviewed at a university, and the position was advertised very differently than what it was when I got there. And so I believed it was a lower level position. And when I showed up, and it was like an 8-person panel interview with, university emergency managers from across the country, I was petrified. And it felt like I was taking a final exam. And I answered all of the behavioral questions well. I love interviewing. I know it's silly, but I love interviewing. I love talking to people, so that's not surprising. But I was asked questions about jargon, and I will never forget this gentleman's face. And I will never forget the question he asked me, and it was, what is incident complex? And I was like, a complex incident? One that's very difficult to manage. I didn't know how to respond to it. So, and believe me, when I took 300 and 400, it is now burned into my brain. I do know what incident complex is. But afterwards, the director of the university's public safety department took me aside and had a really great conversation with me. And he said, in this field, you have to speak the language. And the only way you're going to actually learn it is to participate in everything you can, volunteer for everything, read everything. And I did that, and I learned very quickly now when I hear people speak and they don't know what blue sky or gray sky means, or something as simple as that. I'm like, clearly you're not in the community. So the words mean a lot.
There was I have had so many wonderful, amazing, outstanding people onto this show, and yourself included, obviously. And we've had a couple of people, I think, that maybe overshot. And literally, when I say a couple of people, I mean 2 So if you've seen 115 episodes, if somebody's actually listened to all 115, they might have figured it out. So I don't need to call them out. But there's two people where they definitely overshot, and I had to adjust my conversation with them because I was like, oh, like this is theory for you. Like you
Mhm.
actually don't know. And you talked about something as basic as blue sky versus gray sky. Like that is like 101, like basic. And yet it is actually pretty obvious when somebody's like, "Oh, actually, I don't think you know what that means is." The other thing that happens is when people try to over explain something, and I'm like, "Oh, I think you're trying to work it out in your mind in real time." And that's okay because people do need to work it out. But at the same time, your advice, volunteer wherever you can, read everything you can, get involved. That's exactly what I did. That's the advice that was given to me. That was advice I give to other people. I've done train the trainer. I've done symposiums, like a higher ed symposium, which was nothing to do with what I wanted to do at the time. But I just keep on trying to soak in what other people are trying to learn. And then I really do believe that there's really nothing like responding to a disaster, whether it's somebody's house fire with your Red Cross or a massive hurricane. Understanding what that actually looks like, very different from people who've done it versus who haven't done it for sure.
Absolutely.
In fact, we got rid of a podcaster because he kept on telling people he was like an emergency manager and he's been doing it for 20 years. And we're like, hey, we looked at your resume, man. You actually never done it. So
Well, and I think that goes back to the standardization. What is an emergency manager?
mm,
So,
yeah.
is there a certification? Is there a training you're supposed to take? And it's a profession that's growing, and I'm really excited to be in emergency management at this time because I think it's really exciting. But I also think it's important to recognize that everyone looks at emergency management a little differently and what that means.
It's so funny. It's so broad. Saying emergency management is like saying you're in business. Like,
Exactly.
what do you do? Like, and I think it's actually okay. I think we
Yeah.
should have standardizations. That has to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's okay to say, hey, based off of this standardization, now I can specialize where I need to specialize. Everybody should coordinate. Everybody should collaborate. Everybody probably commiserates together when we had to deal with this
That's
stuff.
that's part.
Yeah, the best city ever. No, but like that's true. But then dealing with business continuity, which is incredibly important, versus creating a shelter, a long-term shelter, like a cooling center in a heat wave, those are different needs.
Yeah.
And it's okay to say that those are different needs.
Well, and I think that was the hardest part. So when I got out of my degree program, trying to get a job in an emergency management agency was darn near impossible.
Mm,
They're very small. People stay there for a very long time. You have to be willing to move pretty much anywhere across the country. And so when I started applying for other positions, I started realizing that there are emergency managers that aren't called emergency managers. And that's when I found the position at the Florida Department of Health and as a preparedness planner. And I had no idea, I knew nothing about public health, but I knew enough about emergency management that, and I worked for the most amazing team in my life, great people. And we had people who specialized in public health. I didn't need to know that. I needed to know enough to do my job. But again, we're going back to that salt and pepper. What are the basics you need? And then learning everything you can about other things along the way. I was once given advice, and I can't remember who it was, but it was somewhere in my degree program. It said, go and find magazines from fields outside of yours and read them and learn about fields outside of what you do. And sometimes there's another field that has an answer to a problem that you've been searching for. So I try to learn everything I can from everyone I can because that just makes me better at my job.
okay, this is starting to be getting kind of like I wouldn't say creepy, but you basically named every single thing that I keep on telling people to do. We wrote an article called the
That means it's right.
Yes, hooray! You're like my second witness here. Um, we wrote an article called the Ashley Model. It's based off of Ashley Loria Golden's work experience and how she approaches emergency management. She's the COO of Doberman Emergency Management. And what you just outlined is what she's done, is what I've done, is what other people like Patrick McGinn has done, really famous guy. He's been on the show a couple times. Kevin Coleman, Rodney Melsick, like all these really great people who have gone through and say, hey, let me just soak in learning. I truly believe the smartest person is in the room is not or the most important person in the room or the smartest person in the room, whatever you want to call it, is not the person who is specialized in the field, but can look across the room and say, I know what all your jobs are. I know your capabilities and your limitations, and I can utilize that. I don't need to
Yeah,
be the expert in public health. I need to be an expert in making sure the public health can talk to the sheltering, to talk to mass communications, to talk to everybody so that there's not miscommunication, right? And
exactly.
essentially, that's what you're calling out. You also called out something else that a lot of emergency managers have reached out to me. I get I would say almost daily at this point, somebody graduating from a program saying, I can't find a job somewhere because of X. Really niche groups. I try to tell them to expand their ideas of what EM is. But you just called out again another thing. I'm talking to you big time here, but you should. It's like move anywhere. You have to be willing to move anywhere to do this job. You have to be willing to grow your perspectives. When I went over to a very large tech firm between the national strike team and Doberman, and I was doing essentially project management, I was looking all the people who were getting the project management like certifications and how they were approaching it. Waterfall versus agile and all this different stuff. I'm like, why isn't this part of EM? This is standard for what we do, and we try to articulate different. So you're right. There's are different fields that can be applicable. Knowledge. Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
I could
No,
talk about this. Great.
and second, project management, 100%, and also change management. A lot of what we do is fixing things, making things better, that process of continuous improvement. And if we're not learning, there are programs of continuous improvement, E3, Kaizen events. Somebody said a Kaizen the other day, and I'm like, I had to Google it. I had no idea what that meant. And when I read what it is, I'm like, I did this all the time in my old role, all the time.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was.
There's a lot of overlap. So we got our salt and pepper is communication and collaboration. I would say the milk and honey is this is getting ridiculous again. Probably project management and like you said, change management.
Yeah.
It's all about moving that needle forward. You have your basic ingredients, and then all that specialization is all the other flavors you want to add into it. By the way, if you just have salt and pepper and milk and honey, it's the most bland. You need to have some more in there. So that is definitely basic. Add more to it. You have definitely added a lot more to it in emergency management and your perspectives and the advice that you've given to people in this episode between how to do job interviews, between getting the right jargon, between how to get more experience, between, be willing to travel, all that stuff to be able to be greater in your career. Really great advice. You're definitely better than basic. This has been a flavorful episode, if you will. Rachel, thank you so much for coming on and talking to me today. And again, big fan of L3 Harris. And I think L3 Harris has a great emergency manager who's doing good things. And I hope that you can continue to do good things to protect the organization and your local community.
Thank you. And I'll see what I can do about those night vision goggles.
Oh my gosh. If you give me night vision goggles, I'll have you on the episode.
I'm not going to get you some, but trying them on.
If I get to try on some night vision goggles, we'll have like a Rachel segment every episode.
Love it.
This is your piece of advice from Rachel at L3 Harris.
I support this. I'll see what I can do.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Okay, so we also mentioned, so I'm just going to wrap this up here for all of our audience. Of course, if you like this episode, 5-star rating and subscribe, all that stuff, social media. But she brought up the idea of getting better at preparedness and response. And we talked about dynamic populations. If you haven't signed up yet, we have a couple spots open. I actually think we actually really are down to a couple spots for our emergency management response for dynamic populations training and certification in Atlanta, Georgia. I believe, Rachel, you're going to be there.
I am. I'm super excited.
So you can meet a super famous Rachel who's doing things right. She's going to be part of our cohort there. Really great stuff. We have the head of EMI, Jeff Stern, coming. We have Pete Gaynor coming from former head of FEMA and acting DHS secretary. We have Steve Johnson, Seaburn, head of Seaburn for British Army. We have Zach Borst and Eddie Bertola. These really great people who are SMEs in their own right. We have really amazing people who are going to be training everybody. So for all those who are listening right now, check out Dynamic Populations at thereadinesslab.com. And we'll see you for next week. If you have a question, by the way, for us or for Rachel, make sure you put it into our social media comments. We always get the emails. We hope for comments on social media as well. And we'll see you for the next one.